When we get into then the hand going not towards us, but away from us, then we might well want to do that drumstick bit. And notice the whole forearm is a bit of a teardrop, isn't it? The whole teardrop integrates almost all the way down. Here's maybe the elbow, let's say. And then right at the wrist, we feel the meat of the mass going into that thinner, more tendinous connection there. So it's tracking right on down. And same here, much subtler. In fact, if we look at it, it's not really doing that. Oops. It's much stiffer, which is okay. We can make one side very stiff or completely stiff, and then get the curve on the other side, and that we'll still get a net curve out of it. So take your pick on that. You could bulge it out as I did here. You can align it more or completely as I was doing there. And then we're going to want to feel, I'm going to be imagining a tube that's a little flat and wide side to side and not as deep as a true tube, front to back. Or I'm going to think of it as a box, or I'll think of it as a mashup of both. And one of the advantages of the box is as soon as you imagine a, whoops, that's not very helpful. As soon as I imagine a box, then as soon as I look at shadow or render shadow, it starts making it clear. We'll add a little bit of the rendered detail here as it goes in, and we'll explain it a little bit later. But we can see now that the tones are showing, the shadow shape is showing the corner where light meets shadow, where back meets front. And as soon as I do that as a box, I go, oh, wait a second. This is much more severe. That is a little more severe. That's not quite so bad, although it's not exactly right. This is way off. One of the advantages, think of that box, just a straight box, is you get much clearer on direction and depth of that kind of three-point perspective. Whereas with a circular form, it's always changing directions, and you just kind of round it. And sometimes you round it too little and you never notice it. But with the box, you sure do. So, boy, I better fix that. So let's bring that, oops. Let's bring that corner down so I can get that line up. And then, of course, this one goes way up here. So So I want this way up here. So I'm gonna may need to adjust that whole curve to get it. Guess I didn't save the other one as I should have, but that's okay. So we correct. And now I can always round this off, of course. In fact, I could use the whole core. And I'll just make this very simple. I can make this whole core a corner plane. Just by thickening it up. And then the last thing we want to do or explore today, let's see here. Is then getting the whole hand. With the forearm. And the wrist. To feel like a drumstick attachment. And this and the other more extreme perspective we saw from the front. See here. Is I'll usually draw the hand bulging in every direction. And then if I have to mitigate because of perspective, then I'll adjust that. But I'm bulging in every direction, and that is setting up the fact that the wrist comes in and then builds into the hand. And that again is not always apparent when we look at how-to ideas or even just a casual look at a hand. And sometimes it just flat isn't any bigger, but usually it wows out wider. And it'll bump out into a teardrop, or it'll be intruded upon like a drumstick, or a little bit of both. So it fits in here. You can see the little thumb there. And now we've got, let me darken that so you can see that. Let's do it this way. And I'm going to make that go in farther than I think it should. I can always back off later. But I really want this to intrude into that. And if I start out like a tube, I'll look at it for a second like a box. And I'll round the back side of that tube, and round the front side of that tube, but I'll meet at a more squarish end. That'll tell me where my rendering wants to be. And if the shadow or the highlight was in a different spot, I'd move that side, those two sides accordingly. And then of course we can check that with each direction. So I put the knuckle line here. Well, it's really over here. So I would adjust it, or I like making a more extreme perspective than it really is. But this one I made less perspective. This is going that way, so we want to go up this way. And I'm just boxing it through. And at the simplest level, and I like to do rendering at the simplest level sometimes, just for practice. Then I would have this wrist bump into this bulbous hand right at the corner, wherever I deem that to be, on where the back of the knuckle meets the side of the knuckle and the finger. Right on through. And I love to come back then and make a simple structure that's pure, simple and not characteristic or barely characteristic. If it were just that fixed here, if it were a boxy stick going into that bulbous drum, would the shadow shape at that simplest possible, is just slightly characteristic. It's not a perfect egg here, right? It's not a perfect tube like a like something for a xylophone or something. It's slightly characteristic, but super simple. And isn't that interesting? When I conceive of the structure carefully and observe the connections strategically, the much more sophisticated, much more close to a simplified, but still a finish solution is acting very much like the model. Now we know that that's a good, simple, yet characteristic idea. So one of the things I'll do is I go through the body, I'll take these little sections with two primary forms or a secondary connective form, whatever it is, as we've talked about today. And I'll break it down into the simplest thing I can that's just slightly flattened to suggest the flatness, slightly as close to the proportion to suggest the proportion. And I'll just plug in that simple drumstick, slightly designed drumstick, or teardrop, or beanbag, and play with that. And sometimes I'll get really interesting discoveries that way. Well, that really boosts my confidence. Rather than just saying that should be a little bigger, or that doesn't look right, something needs to happen in the shadows, as we often get with critiques from others or even ourselves. Now we have a model to compare it to, but we can get more and more complicated. We'll do just a real quick thing and then I'll let you out of here. What if I didn't think of it as teardrops? This we were thinking of as a teardrop. This is a drumstick. What if we thought of a beanbag? Can we integrate that in whole or part? So I'm going to take, that won't work so well. Let's do this. I'm going to take this right here. And think of the wrist and the palm of the hand as a beanbag. Well, when I look over here, I'm having a hard time figuring out how that would be a beanbag because we want it to be this idea. Well, I can use that outside in strategy. I can let this come in and this becomes something else. I'll let this side stay the drumstick kind of idea. Let's put a few fingers in there so you can get the idea of it. I can make this flatter, a little more characteristic of what I see. But I can think of this side as a beanbag, this side as a drumstick. And then I can use let's do this, excellent. So that's not the right one. Well, that's okay. And we'll waste some time doing that. And now I'm going to use not this. I'll do just the knuckle of the ulna and just the this much of the hand, or maybe I'll choose to use this much of the hand, or maybe I'll go off that knuckle, that much of the hand, or maybe I'll use all those. I can play that any way I want. I can end here, in here, or not even worry about this. Just use the pinch side of the beanbag and never use the stretch side. And then it can give me all sorts of other things. Well, that is a wonderful way to create lots of pinches. And that explains why it pinches here. And pinches here. Maybe it pinches there. Just by being curious and play. So I'll do these kind of designs and just play. Is there other ways I can do the same thing that might be better or just different? And can I keep all of that or 5% of that just to make it seem more me or more complicated, more lifelike, more characteristic? But if I can do it through structural ideas, and if I can do it through gestural ideas, then I've got a clear path to critique it. Now that's wrong.